Ben Franklin's World is a production of Clio Digital Media. Hello, and welcome to Ben Franklin's World Revisited, a series of classic episodes that bring fresh perspective to our latest episodes and add deeper connections to our understanding of early American history. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. In our last episode, episode 449, Loren Spears and Linford Fisher led us on an investigation of how Europeans and early Americans enslaved Indigenous peoples as a method of territorial expansion. Once enslaved, imperial powers and early Americans dispossessed Native Americans of their land. Now, during our discussion, Loren and Lynn discussed Indian boarding schools as one form of stealing Indigenous peoples from their land and their tribes. Through boarding schools, the United States government authorized the theft of Indigenous children from their families. And then while at the boarding school, teachers helped steal their culture by ensuring that the children forgot their native languages and labored. As Lynn argued, these institutions demanded labor and confinement, which looked a great deal like enslavement. Now, when most of us picture these boarding schools, we picture the one in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which Richard Henry Pratt established in 1879. Pratt infamously declared that the work of such a school was to, quote, kill the Indian in him and save the man, end quote. But these mid to late 19th century boarding schools are not where the history of Indian boarding schools begins. To find their origins, we must travel back to the early 18th century. In 1723, the College of William and Mary opened the Brafferton Building, a permanent home for an Indian school that the college had been chartered to run and then struggled to fill for its first 30 years. For most of the 18th century, the Brafferton housed a dormitory, classrooms, and the residence of the Indian school's schoolmaster. Now, the premise of the Brafferton was the same premise that the Carlisle School would adopt a century and a half later. Take native boys, teach them English, the Anglican faith, and English ways of thinking and negotiating, then send the boys back home, changed, in the hope that they would be more useful to the British Empire. So what actually happened inside the Brafferton? And how does a school built on a colonial college campus during the reign of King George I connect to schools like Carlisle, which were still separating Indigenous children from their families as late as the 1950s? Today, we revisit episode 367, the first of a two-part series on the history of Indian boarding schools. Our conversation features three scholars. Brooke Bauer, a citizen of the Catawba Nation, who is now an associate professor of history at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and author of Becoming Catawba, Catawba Indian Women and Nation Building, 1540 to 1840. Fallon Berner, who served as the Indigenous historian for the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation's American Indian Initiative, and who is now pursuing a PhD in history at William and Mary. And Buck Woodard, a cultural and historical anthropologist and senior professorial lecturer in the Department of Anthropology at American University. And he's also the co-author of the book, Building the Brafferton, The Founding, Funding, and Legacy of America's Indian School. Now, during our exploration of the Brafferton, our guests reveal why the Brafferton existed, a story that runs through the will of a wealthy Anglo-Irish chemist, a rented farm in Yorkshire, England, and a simple piece of colonial arithmetic. Establish an Indian school, and you unlock money. How the English filled the Brafferton with students, even as native families refused to send their children. And what the Indigenous students did with the knowledge that the English taught them. But first, thank you for listening, thank you for being curious, and for caring about early American history. You know, Ben Franklin's World is a listener-supported podcast. We're independent, which means no algorithms or organizations tell us what stories we can and cannot talk about on this show. This means we have the ability to tell you the complete history, a history that includes the voices of the famous, the everyday, and those who existed on the fringes of early American life. It's you who make this editorial flexibility possible. So if this podcast has become part of your life, if it's something you turn to during your commute, your dog walk, or your quiet Sunday morning, we'd really appreciate your support. Any gift in any amount helps us keep bringing you these conversations that you enjoy week after week. You can make a tax-deductible donation at benfranklinsworld.com/donate. That's benfranklinsworld.com/donate. And if you've already given, thank you. Truly, your generosity is what makes our work possible. All right, are you ready to revisit our exploration of the Brafferton Indian School? Let's go meet our guest historians.
I'm Brooke Bauer. I'm a citizen of the Catawba Nation, which is located just about 25 miles south of Charlotte, North Carolina. I am a potter, and I learned to make Catawba pottery from a long line of really brilliant Catawba women. I'm also an assistant professor of history at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. The way I imagine the Indigenous East of North America is that it was a lot more densely populated than we really imagine. There were many native groups who spoke various languages, and within those language groups, towns and villages, the folks spoke different dialects of those languages.
Brooke is a historian who has been researching the subject of Indigenous schooling in early America and the United States. She's also the author of the book Becoming Catawba, Catawba Indian Women and Nation Building, 1540 to 1840.
So if we're flying from north to south, we would see all of these villages. And there were really powerful men and women leaders who ruled over regional societies in the South. These were called chiefdoms. And these leaders sometimes held authority over up to 30, 40 different smaller tribes. So those smaller tribes answered diplomatically to these rulers. And Europeans, when they arrived here, they called them kings, queens, chieftains, emperors, but they were leaders.
My name is Buck Woodard. I'm a senior professorial lecturer in the Department of Anthropology at American University in Washington, D.C. I'm a cultural and historical anthropologist, and my research focuses on Indigenous North America, primarily the eastern woodlands and the mid-Atlantic region. When the English originally began exploring the Atlantic seaboard, Virginia included all of America, all of what is now the United States, plus portions of Canada. Every coastal area to Cape Hatteras from Nova Scotia had Algonquian speakers. Until you reach the fall line of Virginia, all of them were Algonquian speakers. There was Iroquoian-speaking population, referred to today as the Nottoway and the Meherrin and the Tuscarora, and they were definitely town-based polities, town-based organizations that we call tribes for lack of maybe a better or more appropriate word.
Buck and Danielle Moretti-Langholtz, who is a senior lecturer in anthropology at William & Mary, co-wrote and co-edited the book Building the Brafferton, the founding, funding, and legacy of America's Indian School.
Not all of the towns worked together, even though they may have been related, and so it would be an error to say that all of those towns were one people politically, even though they may have been an ethnic population or a population that were similar in language and culture and practices and beliefs.
It is impossible for us to know exactly how many Native American people lived in North America before the arrival of Europeans. And estimates vary widely from 7 million to more than 100 million when historians offer them. What we do know for certain is that millions of indigenous people lived in North America prior to European arrival, and that there was a great diversity of culture, politics, and trade interests among them. In Senecomica, which is the term local Algonquian speakers used to describe what the English called Virginia, indigenous peoples belong to 3 different language families: Algonquian, Iroquoian, and Siouan. So Virginia tribes provide us with a good example of this great diversity.
My name is Fallon Berner. I am the Indigenous historian at Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Nitap, Wingapo, Koyomataru, Squaskinonia, Falanajatsi, Onewawanda, Ye Onwis, Ometsayome e Koyeti, Ometsayome Indare, and Yomare Huten I Wishas Indi. And basically that's my general introduction in the language. The first one was hello, my friends, in the local indigenous language here, Senecomica Algonquian. And then I continue in Wyandotte to say basically the same thing. Hello, my friends. How are you all? My name is Fallon. In Wendat, actually, I said I am working on learning our language. Here you had a lot of agricultural societies who also subsisted by hunting and fishing. These are large matrilineal societies. Here in Virginia, in particular, I've seen varying numbers, but I think the most current one I've seen is that there were at least 50,000 inhabitants here in the Virginia area prior to contact.
Fallon is active in her work with the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation's American Indian Initiative. The initiative works to research, interpret, and represent the influence the diverse Native nations of Virginia and beyond had on the development of American culture, democracy, and the United States' struggle for and against independence. The goal of the American Indian Initiative is to repeople the landscape of Williamsburg with the indigenous communities who lived and spent time in this area during the 17th and 18th centuries.
We have to keep in mind that there were 3 different language families in Virginia, and today the narrative often gets skewed towards the Algonquian speakers here in Eastern Virginia, and even with that, many folks use the word Powhatan to describe everyone, when that's not necessarily the most accurate.
The English encountered, and the Spanish before them, a number of powerful chiefs in the Chesapeake area, and at the time of Jamestown, one hereditary chief had risen to power in the upper James River area. He was a Pamunkey. That's a community that's adjacent to the James and called the York River Basin. The chief's given name was Wahun Seneca, and his natal town was a place called Powhatan. And the people who were farther away from him or were not closely related to him sometimes referred to him by his natal town of Powhatan.
Not all historians of Indigenous history, and not all Indigenous tribes in Virginia, agree that Wahun Seneca identified as Pamunkey. They do agree he represented and ruled over a very large number of different Virginia tribes, collectively referred to as the Powhatan Paramount Chiefdom.
His people practiced matrilineality, which is a kinship system where ancestry followed the line of the native mother. So in his case, his mother's ancestry and her mother's ancestry would have been most important in his life. Powhatan came to leadership through his mother's lineage. So she must have been from a higher rank status or more elite family. And he must have been the son of a sister to the previous chief.
Wahun Seneca started with just 5 inherited chiefdoms under his rule, and that didn't grow to the 30 and odd number that we hear about in the Jamestown records until after the hostilities began with the Jamestown colonists. And even then, there were indigenous nations here, such as the Chickahominy, who are closest to us here in Williamsburg today, who were in and out of that alliance as it best suited them.
Wahun Seneca expanded his influence from the areas of the Upper James and the Upper York River down the peninsulas towards the coast. And at the time of the English settlement of Jamestown, he controlled just about every Algonquian-speaking town from what is today Richmond to Virginia Beach, and maybe northward towards Fredericksburg.
You would have had Powhatan as the leader, and then below him would be lead headmen from each village who would meet with him and report to him. I think it's really important to understand that these early Virginia tribes each had their own government, they had their own identity, and each made decisions that benefited their people. And so it wouldn't be unusual for these smaller tribes to join with Powhatan in terms of a defense strategy.
By the early 17th century, some of the native peoples of eastern and tidewater Virginia had organized themselves into a complex power structure called the Powhatan Paramount Chiefdom. As Buck Woodard related, the Powhatan Paramount Chiefdom stretched from present-day Virginia Beach, north and west to Richmond, and possibly even as far north as Fredericksburg. The Paramount Chiefdom formed as some smaller tribes, each with their own identity, government, culture, and customs, allied with Chief Wahun Seneca and his 5 hereditary villages to enhance their trade and as a mutual defensive strategy against the incursion of other tribes and later, Englishmen. Some tribes in the Powhatan Paramount Chiefdom joined and left the alliance as it suited their interests. As Fallon Berner and Brooke Bauer related, joining the Paramount Chiefdom did not mean that these smaller tribes had to relinquish their local government, identity, culture, or their interests. But being a member of the Paramount Chiefdom did mean membership dues in the form of tribute or taxes, which member tribes paid to Wahun Seneca in food, furs, and other goods. This organized and powerful structure of indigenous power is what the first English settlers encountered when they arrived at Jamestown in the land they referred to as Virginia, or perhaps more accurately, in the land of Senecomica.
The name Powhatan almost falls off as soon as Wahun Seneca dies around 1618. We really don't hear about the Powhatan chiefdom or the Powhatan peoples, and that name kind of disappears from the historical record. What we do hear about is Pamunkey, and the Pamunkey chiefdom is the hereditary center of that organization. It's unlike any other political organization along the eastern seaboard.
The preferred term nowadays is the Powhatan Paramount Chiefdom. And many of these indigenous tribal nations are still in Virginia today as politically sovereign entities. Some have federal recognition, some have state recognition and federal recognition, such as the Pamunkey, Mattaponi, Upper Mattaponi, Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Rappahannock, Nansemond, Monacan, Patawomeck, Nottoway, and Cheronaka.
The 17th century is really a story about the English and the chiefdom trying to reckon with each other. In some cases, they start off in good relationships with trade. Other instances, it turns bloody very quickly. So it's 100 years of conflict between the chiefdom and the English. We have multiple wars. We tend to refer to those in history as the Anglo-Indian Wars. We have the first one is 1609, it's very early. The second one is 1622, lasts for 10 years. The third one comes in 1644, lasts for a couple of other years. And there are other conflicts through the century.
The conflicts that erupted between the Powhatan Paramount Chiefdom and the English came about in part because of the colonists' demands for indigenous lands, the increased pressures that colonists place on the area's natural resources, which both Native Americans and English colonists relied on, and because the English did not understand the political and military power of their indigenous neighbors, nor the diplomacy that the indigenous peoples of Virginia exercised. Here's Brooke Bauer.
In terms of diplomacy, for the most part, most of the tribes operated in the same way. When they met with other nations, there was a huge ceremony that included speakers giving these really long speeches. They would also include days-long feasting. So their idea of diplomacy really differed from that of the English. And I would say that initially didn't really make sense to Native leaders, in large part because the English wanted to place Native groups in a submissive position politically to their settlements. And they often viewed the Native people near their settlements as savages and would categorize them as either friendly or hostile. So in this early period of American history, diplomacy between the English and indigenous people was typically marked by warfare and violence.
The diplomacy starts almost immediately as the English land. They are given a choice of an arrow, which is war, or a tobacco pipe, which is seen to be peace. These two emblems, an arrow or a hatchet for warfare and a tobacco pipe for peace, those two emblems will continue on beyond the 17th century, into the 18th century, into the 19th century, and even into the present.
Initially, these Native leaders had to teach the English how to conduct diplomacy in the New World. So initially, the indigenous people had the power on the ground, and they could make the terms. And this would be especially true in terms of the practice of reciprocity, which was a big part of Native diplomacy, which was an exchange system. Just to make it a little bit simpler, say, for example, I give you my watch. You may turn around, and it doesn't have to happen immediately, but you turn around and you give me your pen. It's considered an equal and reciprocal exchange.
tribes or native nations have had to observe their other diplomatic party and learn how to make these negotiations go. So a lot of things are done by council. There's a lot of searching for consensus. So when something controversial comes up and a decision needs to be made, it'll often go through a women's council. Then it will go through a men's council. Going to war, for example, the women's council is often going to decide that, and then the men are going to decide how that gets implemented. So the war captains are then in charge of how the war takes place, but it is the women who ultimately decide whether or not they get to go in many communities.
So the English, these are late medieval men coming from a very different orientation of late medieval Europe with kings and queens and duchies and kingdoms. So both groups are having to negotiate who are these new people and what's the proper protocol. We see that the English bend towards native diplomacy styles during the 17th century, but eventually natives are also forced, because of warfare and conflict, to bend towards some of the English forms of diplomacy. One that we can point to that continues into the present are treaties. These are documents that are created by the English that have written language that makes agreements that we're talking about in these negotiations, set in stone, so to say, but set on paper. And that was something that native peoples did not have, a format they did not have. Most of their agreements, as well as their histories, are oral and they're remembered.
Native Americans and the English misunderstood each other's diplomacy. We can see instances, such as those pointed out by Brooke Bauer and Buck Woodard, of each group trying to teach and inform the other how they thought diplomacy should be conducted. But misunderstandings by both sides often happened, especially as English male colonists did not fully appreciate or respect the role Native women played in Indigenous diplomacy. Nor did the English understand why they couldn't just negotiate with one male tribal leader or king when they attempted to buy land, make peace, or enter into a trade agreement.
It's a wonder that anybody survived that time period because there's just so much bloodshed and conflict. But eventually the English do subdue the Pamunkey chiefdom. So by the end of the 17th century, the Pamunkey chiefdom is still an important part of the region's geopolitics, but increasingly the English are engaging with indigenous communities farther and farther west. And so they're expanding their domain, and they're expanding their political and economic relationships to native groups that are not affiliated with these Algonquian speakers on the coast. And so that creates an imbalance. Because of the treaties that are signed, they remain an important part of the British colony, but increasingly there are other communities who are also part of the story and are also allies and enemies of the English.
As the Powhatan chiefdom began to break apart by the middle end of the 17th century, the English established a system of conquest politics and began to negotiate with the, quote, foreign tribes in Western Virginia and beyond, as a way of trying to keep the peace in their growing Eastern Virginia foothold. Here's Buck Woodard.
What emerges in the 17th century is what we call the tributary system. It comes from medieval Europe, whereby a kingdom that is conquered becomes an ally to the conquering king. They're able to control their internal politics. They're able to remain in control of their kingdom, but they are now subservient to the king who has conquered them. So they become a tributary, and they usually pay homage or tribute to the other king, Wahan Seneca, who was chief at the beginning of the 17th century, but also his successors, Opechancanough, Nicatawants, Totopotomoy, and all the other chiefs. When part of the chiefdom was to extract a tribute from their surrounding towns to pay homage to them as the great chief. So that idea of putting the English king in a higher position than maybe the native leaders was understood in the chiefdom world.
In addition to extracting tribute in the form of agricultural products, furs, and land, the English also used their tributary system to extract military service from their tributary tribes.
The English use the tributary system when they move into the West or to engage another native polity. They'll call upon the Pamunkey and Chickahominy warriors to join the English fighters to engage the enemy. This tributary system is enshrined in the treaty language, and the agreements that are made in the treaties are told orally to the native communities. Literacy is not something possessed by the indigenous population in the beginning of the 17th century, but eventually literacy will become part of this diplomatic exchange. The importance of having individuals who could speak multiple languages for both sides and explain what the agreements might be or what the requests might be. And this formula is recognized by the English, and they will adopt some of the native protocols into the 18th century.
The English used this tributary system as a way to exert power, keep the peace, and regulate land and trade. This Virginia-based system became a model that the English borrowed from, adapted, and used pieces of as they pushed into other areas of North America and worked to accomplish their colonization goals. As Buck Woodard related, the use of written treaties became part of a system by which the English and indigenous polities in Virginia enshrined their agreements. The increased use of treaties and the written word really increased the need for the English and native peoples to have members in their own societies who could speak each other's language and read and write English. Of course, rather than learn indigenous languages, the English government preferred a system where they would teach Native American boys something about English religion and culture and how to read, write, and speak the English language. The rise of this new English educational program coincided with the rise of the city of Williamsburg, the grand capital city of the colony of Virginia. Here's Fallon Berner with details.
Colonial Williamsburg being our modern site today that recreates 18th century Williamsburg dates to 1926, almost 100 years ago. But the Williamsburg of the colonial British period dates to 1699, which is when the capital gets moved from Jamestown, just down the road here, up to what was then called Middle Plantation. And there were, as you would expect, vast plantations and farms until they decided to move the city up here. It takes a couple years to get all the buildings and infrastructure in place. And then this is really the hub of commerce, of government. The governor, who is the king's proxy here in Virginia, is located here, and they build a palace for him.
When you visit and walk around the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation today, you will get a feel for the grandeur the capital city of Williamsburg once had. As a seat of colonial and British imperial power in Virginia, Williamsburg attracted many wealthy full-time residents and became the part-time home of other wealthy planters, lawyers, and businessmen who ventured to the capital city each year to conduct their political and other business. The city was also the home of people from the middling and poorer ranks of colonial Virginia society. These people worked for the colonial government, served the needs of the city's visitors and residents by operating some of the finest shops and taverns in the colonies, and took care of the maintenance and infrastructure needs of the city. And like other areas of Virginia, Williamsburg reflected the colony's operation as a slave society. Approximately 52% of early Williamsburg's population was Black, and most of these Black residents lived and worked as enslaved people. And that was just the full-time population. If we could tour Williamsburg when it served as the capital city for the colony of Virginia, we also would have noticed a lot of different indigenous peoples who came from many different tribes and nations within and without Virginia to negotiate agreements of war, trade, peace, and land, and to sell their agricultural produce and trade goods like pottery.
Through the Anglo-Powhatan Wars and the treaties which established reservations here in Virginia, Indigenous people have been pushed off these lands called Middle Plantation, which traditionally they would have used for hunting. We see that they're still in touch with Williamsburg. They're still coming back to this area, but instead of for hunting, because there's no more viable hunting grounds for them anymore, they're coming back to the market to sell their wares. They're coming back to conduct trade.
Williamsburg developed into a cosmopolitan colonial city. It developed into a city with grand buildings, fine shops, and access to the finest agricultural produce and trade goods from within the colony and from all over the world. It also developed into an educated city. 6 years before Virginia moved its capital to Williamsburg in 1693, King William III and Queen Mary II of England chartered two institutions of higher learning. The first was the College of William and Mary, a college founded to educate elite sons and prepare at least some of them for the Anglican ministry, and the Indian School, a school within the college to educate Native American boys in the ways of Anglican religion and English culture and in the English language.
The hope was that William and Mary would be a school for the Virginians to send their young men to, and that we could create ministers or preachers in Virginia, that they would not have to send their young men back to England to be trained in the Anglican Church and verified as preachers and then sent back to the colonies. So the interest from the Virginians was to have a school that could create ministers to better facilitate preaching at the Anglican churches and parishes across the colony.
The Brafferton Indian School was technically chartered with the College of William and Mary in 1693. There's a line in their charter about the education of the Western Indians, primarily in Anglican religion, but also in reading and writing in the English language.
Virginians were enthusiastic about the idea of establishing a college where they could educate their sons and train Anglican ministers who would serve the religious needs of Virginia's ever-increasing population. However, to establish a college, the colony needed financial support from the English government and the Anglican Church. To secure that support, they dispatched an Anglican minister named James Blair to represent their case in London.
James Blair, who was a Scottish clergyman that came to Virginia in the time period of 1670s. He was the commissary for the Bishop of London in Virginia, and he's sent back to make this case that Virginia needs to have a college. And so he goes about using his ecclesiastical networks in the church to find an audience with the crown, to look for funding sources to be able to support this institution.
During Blair's search for money that could be used to open and support a college in Virginia, Blair was introduced to Robert Boyle, a famed natural philosopher or scientist known for his work in chemistry. Boyle hailed from one of the wealthiest Anglo-Irish families, and he was also a devout Anglican.
Robert Boyle, he had translated the Bible into multiple languages. He also was the first to translate the Algonquian language to the Bible. He was engaged with the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in foreign parts and was part of the founding of Harvard. So it became clear to James Blair that Robert Boyle was interested in this type of missionary work, and that if he pitched the idea of having William and Mary be both a seminary and an Indian school. Robert Boyle was elderly, and he had written his will, and he was interested in finding a charitable place for his estate, for his monies.
James Blair successfully persuaded Robert Boyle to fund a college in Virginia that would serve as both an Anglican seminary and an Indian school that would teach Native American boys the Anglican religion and the English language.
The trustees of Boyle's estate, one of the things they did was they purchased a manor in Yorkshire, England, that was called the Brafferton Manor, and it was an agricultural farm. By buying this estate, the trustees would rent the agricultural lands, and annually there would be an income from the agricultural activities in England, and that money was then transferred partially to Harvard and partially to William and Mary. So James Blair comes to find multiple funding streams to assist with his vision of having a school in Virginia, and King William and Queen Mary provide him with a royal charter to establish a university of higher education in their name, as well as an Indian school at the same time.
If you've ever had to stop yourself from going on too long about something you heard on this podcast, because not everyone in your life shares your enthusiasm for early American history, I have a place for you. The History Explorers Club is a virtual community for curious adults who want to explore, discuss, and genuinely indulge in early American history. No scholarly background is needed, just bring your curiosity and your questions. And you can talk to us all day long about what you heard on this show. Now, members of the club get access to 2 live historian events each month, quarterly workshops, monthly club calls, and a 24/7 forum where the conversations are really smart, respectful, and endlessly interesting. Membership is $33 a month or $333 a year, which gets you 2 months free. To learn more about the History Explorers Club or to join, visit historyexplorers.club. That's historyexplorers.club. I can't wait to see you there. 300 years ago, in 1723, enough money had come from Brafferton Manor in Yorkshire, England, to fund the construction of a second school building on William and Mary's campus. This building became known as the Brafferton Indian School, and although the Indian School had been chartered 30 years before the construction of the Brafferton School building, it took the English almost a decade to find enough native students to attend their Indian school.
The 1690s are really about trying to build the institution and establish who's going to be professors and When it gets started, though, it's a small institution. It has one main building, the main college building today. It's called the Wren Building. And there are 5 professors, and there's one professor who's identified as the Indian master who will teach at the Indian school. And so while it may have the appearance that the Indian school was started for the purposes of saving souls and turning Indians into Christians, if we follow the money, the real reason behind its establishment was because there was money earmarked for the propagation of the gospel in foreign parts, and that if you establish an Indian school, you will get access to those funds. So it's a requirement.
This process of Christianization is something that we've seen as a through line throughout the Atlantic World Colonial Project. You saw it as early as the Spanish project in the Caribbean and in what then becomes Mexico. It's a through line in New France as well, up in Canada. And here, this notion that they want to take the native inhabitants and turn them as much European as they can, so that it's also easier for them to have negotiations with these indigenous people who hold the rights to the land that they want access to. And so their thinking is, if we can Europeanize them as much as possible, teach them how we function and teach them to negotiate on our terms, that then maybe they'll kind of come over to our way and become part of our project.
The more stakeholders you find for a project, the more elements and purposes that project will take on. This was the case for the Virginia Indian School. Early Virginians desired a college to educate their sons. To get funding for that college, James Blair added that the college would also teach the sons of Native Americans in the ways of English culture and religion. As Fallon Berner acknowledged, teaching Indigenous peoples the ways of European customs and religion was not a new idea in the 1690s. The Spanish and French had undertaken similar projects in their schemes to establish colonies and bring powerful Indigenous nations to heel under European authority. And the English had also made several attempts at establishing Indian schools even before the Indian School at William and Mary had opened.
Yeah, there definitely are other Indian school projects in North America. In Virginia specifically, around 1619, we see a document come over with instructions to the Jamestown legislature to form an Indian school close to the Jamestown colony. That becomes what we know of as Henricus. It's not super successful. It basically falls apart with the Second Anglo-Powhatan War in 1622. It's just destroyed, and they don't try to recover that project. And then a little bit earlier in the 18th century, we have the Fort Christiana School, which is like southwest of Richmond, close to the North Carolina border today. And Fort Christiana was a success for a time. They got a lot of the Siouan-speaking, Iroquoian-speaking tribes to move into a military garrison. And the governor's purpose with Fort Christiana School was to help create native folks who would be more well-versed in English issues, who could then help negotiate with the frontier tribes as Virginia pushed further west.
As Fallon revealed, Fort Christiana experienced some success when it came to achieving English goals for acculturation. Like the Indian School at William and Mary, the Fort Christiana curriculum focused on teaching tenets of the Anglican religion and English reading and writing. But by 1717, Fort Christiana had lost financial backing and support from the government in London and the Virginia colonial government in Williamsburg. So the school closed, and its headmaster returned to Williamsburg to teach the native boys at William and Mary, which, after years of struggling to attract students, was finally starting to gain traction.
It was really important to colonial leaders, governors specifically, to secure the areas where white settlers lived. So they're securing settlements, English settlements from natives that they view as hostile. We have to keep in mind that at the same time, these native groups were hostile because they're fighting to hold on to their land. But early on, the English start to stress that it's impossible to educate native adults. So when I use the term educate, I mean assimilate, to make them in the image of the English. They're saying it's impossible to assimilate native adults because they're so fixed in their customs.
The English established the Indian School at William and Mary for the purpose of teaching Native American boys English language and customs. Colonial governors hoped that by teaching Native American boys how the English worshipped, thought, and negotiated, they would one day grow up to assist their peoples in selling land, and in brokering and keeping the peace with English settlers. However, Native American communities did not prove eager to send their male children to be educated by the English, especially when the education proposed by the English differed greatly from the education that Native Americans provided their children. Here's Brooke Bauer.
It's important to think about education within these indigenous communities in the 1600s. During this time period, Native people did not think of education as we define it today. In other words, schooling wasn't set to certain hours of the day, nor did their youth attend a school in a specific structure. Instead, their education focused on everyday life circumstances. One of the most well-known and documented Catawba women of the time, when she was a young girl, Sally New River, would have learned how and when to cultivate and harvest crops, gather herbs and nuts, and collect water. Sally learned from her mother how to cook, mix herbal curatives, and she learned what spiritual practices were important to her people. She may have even learned how to defend herself with a knife, because from the 1600s all the way through to early 1800, Eastern North America is a very violent place. And so both men and women of different ages had to learn how to defend themselves. In her teens, Sally would have apprenticed with her mother's mother, her maternal grandmother, to learn how to make pottery. And this was an important stage of her life that would have signaled just one step in her transition to womanhood by showing how she could provide for her own family.
Similarly, young boys also learn the ways of their people and how to help their families and communities survive within the world around them.
Young boys, like Sally's future husband, General New River, when he was around the age of 6 to 8. And this was a time when children really began to engage in complex thinking and become more task-oriented. So they are improving their balance, coordination, their communication. So at this time, the uncles, a mother's brother, took on the instruction of young New River. And he learned things that we typically don't associate with childhood in today's time. He would have learned how to defend himself, how to defend his family, his community. He would have learned how to make weapons, and he would have learned how to hunt. When New River killed his first deer or bear, it symbolized one of several steps into manhood, because this skill proved that he could provide for his family. And one of the most important steps as a young boy moved into manhood included what was called the Huskanal among many Southern tribal groups. And this was a many days long ceremonial rite of passage where a boy was sequestered in the forest. He went into the forest alone, stayed there for several days, and then he returned to his people. And upon that return, he had transitioned into an adult. It's a lot more complex than that, but that's the gist of it. So all these teachings that Sally and New River received would help them survive in their world. Each would have learned the history of their people and families. And most of this information was transmitted orally. So children began to memorize stories that had truth to them. And then when they reached adulthood, they would pass these stories, these histories, to a younger generation.
If Native American communities sent their young boys around the ages of 6 to 8 years old to the English Indian School at Williamsburg, those boys wouldn't have returned home to their communities until they were preteens and teenagers. Therefore, any boys sent to the English Indian School would lose out on the most critical years of their cultural and tribal educations. And this was at a time when Indigenous peoples needed to raise all of their children in Indigenous ways because all Eastern Native communities were experiencing severe population loss. This is one reason why Indigenous communities proved very reluctant to send their male children to the English Indian School.
Let's think about what some of those early students who came to the college, the relationship at the beginning of the 18th century of the Crown's representatives in Virginia, the governor, the executive council with Indian nations. They were in a forced peaceful relation. They had treaties that governed their relationships and protocols for how each other were to interact with one another. But it was a time period of great stress for the Native communities. Population loss had been significant through 17th century. Some data suggest maybe as much as 90% decline for the Indian population of coastal Virginia.
Indigenous population loss happened for several reasons. First, European diseases like influenza ravaged Native communities. A second reason was warfare. In Virginia, traditional tribal enemies continued their own conflicts, and they also fought with English peoples in skirmishes and warfare over the Englishmen's first 100 years of settlement. And a third reason for population loss was slavery.
Indian slavery was ubiquitous in Virginia at the end of the 17th century. Some suggest as many as 50,000 Native peoples were enslaved and exported from the South prior to 1700. So that's a large number of people moving into chattel slavery for purposes of forced labor in agriculture, sugar plantations in the Caribbean, tobacco plantations in Virginia. So when the invitation comes from the governor of Virginia to send a few students to the Brafferton School, there's great concern from the Native leaders about whether or not this is a ruse, whether they'll ever see their children again because of the slavery.
The English encountered skepticism, hostility, and outright refusal from Native American communities to send their young boys to the Indian School. So the English changed tactics to recruit students. One tactic involved using treaty language to force Indigenous peoples to send a few of their boys to the Indian School.
They definitely were not lining up to send their children to the Brafferton at first. They opened the Brafferton School and just sort of waited. Some outreach, I'm sure, was done to the tribes, but none sent any for a long time. And there was some concern by the Virginia Indigenous parents that their children would be used as hostages.
If we look at Virginia, when negotiating peace treaties, the colonial governors usually included some type of language about educating or civilizing Native children, usually boys. And boys were targeted because they would grow up to be leaders, to be diplomats and fighters. So essentially holding these boys, usually the children of influential tribal leaders, holding these boys as hostages. Governors hoped to keep Native leaders peaceful. Looking back, we can see the power dynamics at play. It was a power play by the English. It was their way of trying to guarantee that Native leaders and the men of those communities, the fighters in those communities, would stay in line and wouldn't go against the colony. Because if I have your child and I'm holding your child in my house, you're going to be less inclined to make any kind of attack on the house as a group because the child might be hurt. Or heaven forbid that the people holding these children might kill them. They might sell them as slaves.
The first boys documented as attending William and Mary's Indian School appear in the records beginning in 1702. Unlike many subsequent students who attended the Brafferton Indian School, the English seem to have purchased these first students.
In 1702, there were 4 Native boys delivered to the school. They had been taken captive by the Catawba, so they were from other tribes, but we don't know which tribe.
They're written as Catawba boys, but really we're not sure what tribe they're from. We know that the Virginia government and the Governor's Council that runs William and Mary at the time were not getting any students enrolling, and they were anxious to have those students so they could continue drawing their funding for this project from England. So they decide they have to go out and get students. So they go down to Catawba country, which is now sort of South Carolina area, and they purchase 4 boys that we think might have been enslaved by the Catawba. So they might come from another nation. Again, we're just not really sure. So they enter the record as 4 Catawba boys, but that's because they are purchased from the Catawba.
I don't know how long they had been with the Catawbas. It could have been that they had been there for most of their young life, or it could have been that they were recent captives. And by the time they get to Brafferton, in either case, I imagine these children were probably traumatized. But like boys of all times, they're going to try to be a little man. They're going to try not to show their fear. Imagine showing up at this building full of people that you didn't know, people who are so unlike you, them speaking to you, and you don't understand a word of what they're saying. I imagine this was very traumatic for them. Based on the little research that I've done, they were still there by 1711. So they weren't enslaved and they weren't sold in to slavery.
As Brooke Bauer stated, the English used their Indian school in part as a power play to keep Native communities in line with English expectations for peace. It seems this was especially true for the Catawba people.
In terms of Catawbas at Brafferton, this goes back to the peace treaty negotiations, especially after the Yamasee War of 1715. Catawbas had sided with the Yamasee, or it's probably more accurate to say that the Catawbas had opposed the colonists, and they had joined this attack that the Yamasee started. But very quickly, Catawbas ran out of firearms. They ran out of ammunition, out of gunpowder. And so they send a Waxhaw Indian leader to talk to Governor Alexander Spotswood in Virginia to ask about reopening the trade network between the two. The final deal was, yes, we'll do this, but you have to give us the boys of each headman. So by 1716, 11 Catawba boys were delivered. But this is in Fort Christiana. In terms of Catawbas at Brafferton, that really doesn't happen until the 1760s that we know with certainty.
The English did not want to be in the business of purchasing all of their Native students as they did with the Catawba captives. So they continued to force Native communities to send boys via treaty agreements. And they also attempted to attract students by addressing the desire of Indigenous peoples for their boys to be safe and well taken care of.
So the governor says we want these students to come to the university, and so they make the offer to send an adult to be a proctor with the first students so that they can watch over them to ensure that they're not going to be kidnapped and enslaved, to make sure that they're looked after properly, well fed, that they're safe, and that they can continue speaking their native language so that they'll have somebody to converse with, because not everyone in the broader Virginia area speaks the same native language. So having someone there that they could converse with was seen to be important. From the English perspective, it was important because they were hoping these were going to be ministers that would then go back to their communities and preach the gospel and possibly convert people from their towns.
Governor Spotswood, we see him writing that he needs to explain to the Indigenous parents that their children will not be enslaved. He eventually decides to give them a stick with a carrot at the end of it. He says, every year that you will send 2 of your boys to be students at our school, we will remit your tribute. And it is at this point, taking the tribute payment off the table, that then tribes are sending their children. He offers more reassurance, stating that they could bring a man from their country with them. It reassures the tribe who is sending them that their child will be safe because they have a full-grown adult there to protect them and watch over and observe how that child is being treated.
Governor Spotswood's tactics of attracting students by remitting the yearly taxes or tribute Eastern Virginia's tribes had to pay to the English government and allowing communities to send an adult man to watch over their students worked.
Spotswood has eventually, from about 10 tributary tribes, about 24 students. In terms of our research, that's the highest number of students at any one year is 24. At that time, William and Mary's wider population may have only been 25, 30, or 40 English students.
If you're familiar with a little school called Harvard, they had an Indian school. It's not considered as successful as the Brafferton because over the course of roughly 50 years, I think their school's open from like 1649 to 1699 or 1700, roughly that 50-year period. They only have probably at most 6 students over that 50-year period, and not all of them graduate fully through the program. Whereas the Brafferton, it's technically open from 1693 to 1784, but it has students we know of that we can document from about 1702 to 1778. So the Brafferton is just open for a much longer period of time. And even at its high watermark year, there were 24 students in 1 year here. So already in 1 year, they've quadrupled the amount of students that the Harvard School ever had over its entire 50 years that it was open.
You can see in the early decades that the native ratio to English ratio, maybe even more Indians than English at William and Mary, or in some cases it's half. Other times it might be a third, but it's not the kind of campus we have today where there's thousands and thousands of students. We're really talking about fewer than 100 students on campus during the 18th century from any group. So that when we look at the rosters of William and Mary, we see numbers like 40, 60. And so if you have 10 native students or 5 native students, you can do the math.
During the 76 years the school operated, the Brafferton welcomed students from approximately 40 different tribes. The Eastern Virginia tribes that had once been a part of the Powhatan Paramount Chiefdom sent the majority of students to the Brafferton, with the Pamunkey Indian tribe sending the most students. Fallon Berner and Brooke Bauer have more details about the students' day-to-day lives at the Brafferton.
The boys sent to the Brafferton are going to be wearing English-style clothing. We know that they have 2 uniforms, one for the summer season that's going to be more of a linen, natural colors. They've got a winter uniform that has a green jacket. Our tailors are actually reproducing both of those uniforms this year, so you'll be able to come and touch them up close if you're here to see how those uniforms are made. So they're wearing English-style clothing, but they're likely still retaining their own hairstyles. They might be wearing their own adornment still.
The children's day-to-day lives at Brafferton would have been really scheduled, strictly structured. They would have gotten up early in the morning. Maybe they had some domestic or household chores that they had to do, like cleaning, doing their laundry, or maybe they had to go out and milk the cow. But for the remainder of the day, they would learn from the Bible. That's how they learned how to read. And that would end up being how they learned to write English. Hugh Jones, who visited one of the schools in the 1700s, he said they can recite their catechisms perfectly.
We have an understanding of the curriculum. They were all taught to read and to write, taught arithmetic, math. They were taught divinity, aspects about the Anglican Church, whether those be catechisms, the Lord's Prayer, using the English Book of Common Prayer. There was no dining facilities in the Brafferton, so the boys would always go to the main building for their meals. And each week they would attend services in the Wren Chapel. So that continued interaction for the purposes of prayer and the purposes of food and for the library ensured that the elites of the Virginians and of the students that were there continued to have great familiarity with one another. Once a month, the students were taken to Bruton Parish Church, and at that time, it was a multiracial congregation. So those are daily activities and weekly activities. Some of the records indicate that Brafferton students emerged from their time in Williamsburg with a fondness for some of the country dances or fiddle music.
The written records historians have access to about the Brafferton students are sparse. For example, we don't know how many Indigenous boys studied at the Brafferton, which also means we don't have a record of the names of all the Brafferton students. What we do have are stories about some of the boys who attended the school and what they did after they returned to their communities.
They came to Williamsburg at 7 or 8 years of age, and that was their understanding of the world up to that time from an Indigenous perspective. They stayed for 2 years, 4 years in some cases. Some students actually stayed longer. But when they came back, they were at odds with their contemporaries because they didn't get the same instruction in hunting and in warfare. And so there are comments from Native communities that when our students come home from your schools, they don't know how to behave in the Native fashion. They're not useful to us for warfare. They're not useful to us in the ways of the forest and hunting. But there's also other records that say they are very useful to us in terms of being able to translate.
John Nettles was one of the first Catawba boys that we know of with certainty to attend Brafferton. Nettles was very insistent while he was there that he would always be an Indian. It didn't matter how much English he learned. It didn't matter how much he could recite from the Bible. He said he would always be Catawba. And so he returns home by 1774, and he becomes very involved in the community. He marries a Catawba woman. A local white neighbor meets him and says he dresses just like the rest of the Catawba men. So I imagine he was probably in buckskins. Maybe he had a scalp lock. Maybe he had a tattoo, but he could read and write. And that became really instrumental as Catawbas moved into this period where they began leasing land. And there are a couple of leases where most of the leaders just made their marks. John signed his full name.
John Montour, he attends the school in the mid-1750s. When we have a name, we can then do further research and try to find out more about that person's life as an adult. And Montour comes from a very significant family in the woodland diplomacy of the 18th century and late 17th century. He's actually the third generation of his family to act in the capacity of a translator. His father, Andrew Montour, is critical to a number of key treaties that are translated among the Algonquian speakers, such as the Shawnee in Delaware and the Six Nations, the Haudenosaunee, with the colonies of Pennsylvania, New York, and Virginia. He's respected by both Native communities as well as the colonies because of his oral mastery of multiple Native languages and the protocols that he understands about Native communities and the British. He's really seen as an asset by both sides. He's critical to some of the negotiations at the conclusion of Lord Dunmore's War. And then we also see that he is very much a part of the Revolutionary wartime era. He doesn't always stay on one side. He's a complicated figure.
A Wyandot man named Henry Bobby was the last student of the Brafferton School from 1775 to 1778. He was born, we think, around 1760, so he's a teenager when he arrives in 1775. And that year, 1775, the Wyandot attended peace talks with Virginia representatives at Fort Pitt, where the Wyandot were to receive compensation for some of their warriors lost during Dunmore's War the prior year. And one of the interpreters for these proceedings was John Montour. Henry Bobby was in attendance at these talks with an elder Bobby, Odinquanarun, a chief of the Striped Turtle Clan and probably a maternal uncle of the younger Bobby. By November, Bobby was in Williamsburg, a student at the Brafferton. And at this time, the Wyandot were one of the most influential Native nations in the Ohio country. So Colonel, later Governor Patrick Henry, was keen to court the Wyandot for the American cause, while the British were trying to make overtures as well. So we see this push and pull tug of war over specific tribes in the Ohio region in order to get them on their side for the American Revolution. We have invoices for the clothing and other supplies purchased for Henry Bobby, and actually quite a deal of money was being spent enough evidence for us to think that they were spending a little bit more on Bobby than they had on previous students. And so they're courting Bobby's tribe through Bobby. They're wanting to make sure that he feels like he has whatever he needs and that Virginia's representing themselves well in the eyes of the Wyandot.
We don't really know how Robert Scholar thought about his time at the Brafferton, but the evidence suggests that he had some positive thinking or some positive relationship to the experience because he took the title of scholar as his surname. And at that time, communities in the region began using English names as like a doing business as name. So they may have a native name, but they also had an English name. So it appears that Robert was the one that was given to this individual, possibly through his baptism when he was in Williamsburg. And so at times in the documentary record, he's known as School Robin, and then later Robert Scholar. But he's not the only one that took that surname. There appears to be multiple Nottoway students who took the last name of Scholar as reflective of their experience at the school in Williamsburg. And then that surname will be passed down genealogically among the Nottoway people for the next couple hundred years. But as an adult, he signs documents on behalf of the whole tribal council. So when a document's completed, we can see that Robert Scholar writes the name of each one of the headmen. And then adjacent to the headman's name, typically they put an X because probably they're not literate and they can't sign their name. So he's the one writing their name. Robert, as an adult, will join the Virginia forces in the French and Indian War, and he's a critical individual under the leadership of a young Lieutenant George Washington in rallying some of the Nottoway, Meherrin, and Tuscarora warriors to fight alongside the Virginians. And he is called out for distinction later in his military service by the General Assembly and is given a monetary award for his service. It's a pretty rare recognition of the House of Burgesses of an Indigenous person's role in a military function. So Robert Scholar is a decorated military veteran as an ally of the Virginians.
John Montour, Robert Scholar, John Nettles, and Henry Bobby. Their stories reflect some details about what the Brafferton students learned while in Williamsburg. They knew how to read, write, and speak English. They knew how to interact with both Indigenous communities and English communities. These men knew how to broker agreements and help ensure that their Indigenous communities maintained their sovereignty.
So these boys are going home and using their writing skills that they know how to write not only in the English language and communicate what needs to be communicated, but they know how these documents are meant to be written. And so they become sort of good translators and scribes for their tribes to make these negotiations happen. They also understand a little bit about British thought and how the British function. And so I'm sure they're able to go home and advise the council members who are making these diplomatic negotiations what their predictions of British actions would be so that they can plan how to best set up their own situation.
I believe, based on the history of John Nettles, that most of these children, when they returned home, their tribes benefited from their education. If they didn't become leaders, then they were very integral, very important to tribal politics, tribal diplomacy, and it would benefit the tribal nations a great deal. Because if you can think about this, most of the leaders before 1770, they chose not to speak English, even if they knew it. They refused to speak English. So having a returned student who could do this made sure that they could continue to exercise their sovereignty as a tribal leader and even preferencing their language over English.
As with most European customs and trade goods, Indigenous peoples learned how to adapt European ways for their own benefit and use. And this is true of the students they sent to the Brafferton Indian School, whatever the reason they sent them, whether it was by English coercion or voluntarily, in order to have someone in their communities who could read, write, and speak in English, and be familiar with English ways. The Brafferton and the education it provided was multifaceted, and when I asked our guest scholars what they thought the legacy of the Brafferton Indian School was, their answers reflected these multiple dimensions.
One of the legacies of the Brafferton is that William and Mary is a college. The the Brafferton funding supported the infrastructural development of the College of William and Mary for almost 100 years. And it continues to be an important building on the historic campus of the College of William and Mary. So in some ways, the legacy of the Brafferton is its continuity with the current higher education institution. But also because Williamsburg is at the epicenter of English and British colonialism in North America, most of that region is devoid of any indigenous names, peoples, visibility. It's almost been wiped completely clean of indigeneity. It is one of the most colonized places in native North America. So that the Brafferton stands today as kind of a silent sentinel for Native peoples' positionality in this history, and as a reminder of the importance of Native peoples to the development of Virginia and eventually of America. The Brafferton really does stand as a visual reminder that Native peoples are a part of society, both in the past and continuing into the present.
The legacy of the Brafferton Indian School is one of cultural negotiation on both sides. It is a lot of things wrapped into one. It is a British attempt at cultural assimilation of Indigenous peoples. It is a British imperial attempt at control over other sovereign nations whose territory they would like to encroach on in order to increase their own population and by proxy their own wealth of their imperial project. It is a project that we see repeated by the Americans a century later when things like disease and warfare have depleted population numbers to the point where the American project, which has very similar intentions and setup to the British project, succeeds more because of a decreased population, because of settler encroachment onto more and more land. So to me, the legacy, it's a conversation about settler colonialism, but it is also, on the flip side, a conversation about the negotiation power of tribes here in the 18th century. If we really think about, for example, the difference in the educational projects of Indigenous students from the 19th century to the 18th century, the Virginia tribes had a lot of power.
Well, the Brafferton and I would say early schools like the Indian College at Harvard, they were the foundation for what would come later. If we examine the Indian boarding schools of the late 19th and early 20th century, we can see some of the same policies being put into action. The way that they were taught is similar, with the purpose or the final goal being that they would be assimilated into mainstream American society, just like the goal with Brafferton, to assimilate these children and make them over as English subjects. But I think Brafferton is really one of the foundational schools where this policy of educating to assimilate continues into the 1950s.
The story of the Brafferton's connections with the Indian boarding schools that operated within the United States from the mid-19th century through the mid-20th century will serve as the topic for our next episode. We'll see to what extent the model established by the Brafferton and other English and British Indian schools of the 17th and 18th centuries influenced the founding of these later schools and their mission to Americanize Indigenous people by stamping out Indigenous culture. We'll also investigate some great and creative strategies Indigenous peoples here in Virginia have undertaken to undo the more than 400 years of colonization and cultural assimilation. But before we go, I'd like to leave you with something Fallon Berner mentioned when I asked her about the Brafferton's legacy.
This school is very important to the tribes who attended, in particular, the Virginia tribes, who not only sent students, they sent the most students, the highest volume of students came from the tributary tribes, but it's also on their land. Historically, ancestrally, this is part of the territory that their people have been on for thousands of years. And so it's important to recognize that there was an institution here that was dedicated to building a relationship with them and that provided a kind of education that they were able to use to their advantage. I think it's important in terms of reconciliation to say their names, to say the names of the boys that we know of were here, to honor those tribes.
We think it's important to say their names too. So here are my colleagues from around William and Mary and the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation honoring the names of the students who we know attended the Brafferton Indian School and the tribes who sent them.
1702, 4 captive boys, unknown tribal origin, purchased from the Catawba.
1711, 1 Chickahominy, 2 Meharin, 2 Nansemond, 2 Nottoway, 3 Pamunkey.
1712, 24 students, 4 brought by the college years ago, and from all the towns of our tributary nations, which are Chickahominy, Meharin, Nansemond, Nottoway, Occoneechee, Pamunkey, Saponi, Susquehannock, Tuscarora, Tutelo.
1713, 17 students, however, no names or tribal designations noted in records.
1723, at least 1 student, John West.
1732, traveler Hugh Grove noted, quote, as many as 7 or 8 at a time, end quote, during the 1720s.
1735, at least 1 student, including Robert Scholar.
1736 to 1742, at least 3 students, including William Jeffries, Thompson, John Ward.
1743, at least 4 students, including Scarborough, Stephen, Tompkins, John Ward.
1744, 6 nations, Cayuga, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Seneca, Tuscarora, quote, remembered some of their youth, had formerly been educated in that college, unquote.
1745, at least 1 student, including Stephen.
1750 to 1753, at least 2 students, including Alexander Scholar, Thomas Stepp, dates approximate.
1754 to 1755, William Cook, Gideon Langston, John Langston, John Montour, Charles Murphy, John Sampson, Thomas Sampson, William Squirrel.
1763 to 1765, 3 students, no names or tribal designations noted.
1766, at least 1 student, Sampson.
1767, 2 students, no names or tribal designations noted.
1768, 3 students, no names or tribal designations noted.
1769, at least 3 students, including Robert Mersch, John Nettles, and George Sampson.
1770, 1772, 5 students, including Robert Mersch, John Nettles, and George Sampson.
1773 to 1774, 5 students, including Robert Mersch, George Sampson.
1775, 6 students, including Henry Bobby, George Sampson, Reuben Sampson.
1776, 5 students, including Henry Bobby, James Gunn, Edmund Sampson.
1777 to 1778, at least 1 student, Henry Bobby. Catawba Indian Nation, Pamunkey Indian Tribe, Wyandot Nation, Occoneechee Band of Saponi,
United Katua Band, Chickahominy Indian Tribe, Cherokee Nation, Halawa Saponi Indian Tribe,
Nansemond Indian Nation, Wyandot of Anderton Nation, Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina, Rappahannock Tribe,
Seneca Nation of Indians, Salamanca, New York, 6 nations of the Grand River Reserve, Stockbridge, Muncie Community, Seneca Nation of Indians, Oil Springs, New York,
Saponi, Upper Mattaponi Indian Tribe, Wyandot Nation of Kansas, Kansas-Delaware Tribe,
Nottoway Indian Tribe, Oneida Nation of the Thames, Seneca Cayuga Nation, Tonawanda Band of Seneca,
Delaware Tribe of Eastern Oklahoma, Tuscarora Nation, La Nación Huron-Wendat, Moravian Delaware of the Thames First Nation,
Cheronaca Nottoway Indian Tribe, Mattaponi Tribe, Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, Oneida Indian Nation,
Seneca Nation of Indians, Allegheny, New York, Seneca Nation of Indians, Cattaraugus, New York, Munsee Delaware Nation, Oneida Nation.
Chickahominy Indians, Eastern Division, Delaware Nation.
Two schools built on the same premise a century and a half apart. The biggest difference between them was power. When Virginia's governors wanted Native students, they didn't simply take them. They negotiated. Alexander Spotswood, in particular, remitted the tribute payments that Virginia's tribes owed the colony for as long as those tribes sent boys to the Brafferton. Plus, the colony also agreed that a grown man could accompany the tribe students to make sure that the English clothed, fed, housed, and kept the boys safe. Sending this adult man also ensured that the boys could continue speaking their own language. The British wanted these boys to grow into young men who spoke English and understood British ways, with the hope that they might become the principal future diplomats and negotiators for their tribes. In the 18th century, Native families had the power to demand these terms from the British government in exchange for sending their children to the Brafferton. But we shouldn't mistake negotiation for consent. The school's first 4 students were captive boys, purchased from the Catawba in 1702 because no Native family would send their children to the Brafferton. And when Spotswood wrote to London about his recruiting for the school, he described the children that he wanted as hostages, 2 from the great men of each town to be held at the college. Virginia's tribes had leverage over the terms, but they had none over the demand. The English intended to come for their children. Now, by the time the Carlisle Indian Boarding School opened its doors in 1879, Indigenous peoples were not in the same place where they could demand the same or similar terms from the United States government. As Fallon Berner made clear, the American project of Indian assimilation succeeded where the British project only partly did, not because the idea had improved, but because disease, warfare, and settler encroachment had left Native nations with far less room to refuse. Brooke Bauer named this through line between the Brafferton and later Indian boarding schools plainly. The Brafferton was one of the foundational schools, and its policy of educating to assimilate ran straight through from that school into the 20th century. So the theft of Native children and culture and the coercion that Loren Spears and Linford Fisher described in episode 449 were not inventions of the industrial United States. These were colonial inheritances that were refined, funded, and scaled once the balance of power had tilted far enough to make Indigenous refusal impossible. Now, as we think and talk about this history of Indian boarding schools and Indigenous enslavement, it's important for us to remember that every child who went to one of these schools had a name, a family, and came from a Native nation. These were real people. They were as real as the Brafferton student John Nettles, who insisted during his time in Williamsburg that he would always be Catawba, and he was right. After his time at the Brafferton, Nettles returned home, married a Catawba woman, and then served his nation as a translator and negotiator for the better part of 40 years. And where other Catawba headmen signed their mark to the land leases they negotiated, John Nettles signed his name, a signature that shows us an exercise of Native sovereignty using a borrowed tool. You can find more information about our guests, Brooke Bauer, Fallon Berner, and Buck Woodard, their books and publications, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/367. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Joseph Edelman, Karen Wolf, Bria Felicien, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. Finally, next week in episode 450, we'll continue our exploration of the American Revolution and Native nations with a look at the history of the Delaware tribe of Indians and their participation in the Revolution. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Clio Digital Media.